Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's May 16, 2022, and today we are speaking with Jessica Mudditt, author and journalist, about her recent book, Our Home in Myanmar, 4 Years in Yangon, which is a memoir based on Jess's own experiences living and writing in the city with her husband Sherpa. Hello, Jessica.
Hi, Luke. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. So congratulations on writing this book. I think we should get started by opening the floor to you to reflect on why and how you wrote it.
Sure. Well, I originally thought that it would be a light-hearted book. And for me, it is still, many aspects of it are lighthearted, but I thought it would be part of a new type of storytelling about Myanmar, which compared to earlier books, would be quite positive and optimistic, because I was writing about the new Myanmar, the Myanmar that was, opening up to the world, and it was democratic and you could be a foreign journalist, safely enough. And as I finished writing it, the coup of February 2021 occurred. And then I realised, as I say in the epilogue, that I'd written a history book. And I'm just really glad that I didn't delay writing it, because I wouldn't be able to write it now. I'd see everything as an omen of, what was to come, rather than living in Myanmar, very hopefully, as so many people did, especially after the general elections of 2015. But I thought, regardless, that opening up period it was such a special time. There were so many changes that I wanted to sort of capture that in book form, which I wasn't able to do as a journalist.
Yeah, and since 2010, quite a lot of foreigners came into Myanmar and left again, with a large exodus at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic and again with the February 2021 coup. But your own story ends earlier than that, so let's try to bookend the book. When and why did you move to Myanmar originally, and when and why did you leave?
So I had wanted to go to Myanmar for many years, but it hadn't been possible. So then it was 2012, and I was living in Bangladesh, and I had a friend who had worked for Ross Dunkley, the publisher of the Myanmar Times. She'd worked for him in Cambodia, where he also owns a newspaper. And that was the opening, and I just seized on it. And I just wrote to him on Facebook and said, please, could I come and work for you? And he said, sure, we need more journalists. Come. So I did that, and I worked on a tourist visa, and it was only a trial, so nothing was a given. But fortunately, I remained for 4 years. It was a sad way to leave, and it did leave a bitter taste in my mouth because it was so abrupt. My husband, Sherpa, is from Bangladesh, and he was having extended visa troubles, mysterious visa troubles. We could not get to the bottom of what was going wrong. And I actually thought his passport had been lost, because the immigration department had kept it for a long time. I'm almost certain that it was because he was Bangladeshi that they just didn't renew his business visa. So he got locked out. And of course, I was effectively locked out too. So I packed up very quickly, my cat and my home, and we were gone. And that was September 2016. And then a month after that, the terrible genocide against the Rohingya began, which is just unspeakably bad. I mean, what happened to us disrupted our lives. But I just feel the timing would be too coincidental not to think that Sherpa, who had lived there for 4 years, was suddenly denied entry. It didn't make any sense. He hadn't done anything. He hadn't been outspoken or whatever. And other Bangladeshi friends had also been effectively kicked out without being told that we were kicked out. So, Sherpa never got to say goodbye to his colleagues or the country. That was really sad. So he kind of never got to have any closure about that, unfortunately.
Yeah, of course, I read about it in the book, and yeah, it's an awful way to have to leave. If we backtrack now to the how of writing. Life writing is not easy, so what were the challenges in putting this book together for you? And what was your source material? You kept a blog, did you keep a journal? And is the book a collection of what was written at the time, or did you write it retrospectively?
It's a bit of both. Yes, I kept a diary. I'm also a copious photo taker and social media user, so I document everything. I think it's habitual as a journalist. It's also partly the stories behind the stories. So when I'm writing about cobras in Yangon, I got the chance in my memoir to put myself into the story, how I felt eating the cobra in the restaurant and how I felt when I saw the poor animals, you know, the armadillo and things in the restaurant where they were also serving up cobra. But it was challenging. I mean, so I came back to Sydney. I was working as a journalist full time. I had 2 children who are now 1 and 3. And on top of that, I got divorced from my husband. So I was writing the book as we were separating. So I had to compartmentalize my relationship that was ending of 10 years, but still being able to write about our relationship in the beautiful way that it existed at the time. That was probably the most challenging aspect. But it was also really cathartic to go back to a happy place, because so much of my time in Myanmar was happy and it was so memorable that I looked forward to writing the book. And kind of when your life is falling apart and you've got newborn babies who are 20 months apart and stuff, to have something steady like a book. And I'd get up early in the morning and write it, and I'd apportion a little part of my workday to it. I'd just write any chance I got. And I looked forward to it because it was like my steady companion, you know, and I actually made progress on it, unlike, you know, other things where it feels like you're sort of going backwards or in the wrong direction, that's for sure.
Yeah, and your experience was different to many other foreigners who came to Myanmar at that time, who may have come as a backpacker or come with a contract and worked at a single organisation for 1, 2, 3, 4 years and then left. You had many separate professional experiences. You worked at several organisations. So do you want to run through your career in Myanmar? I mean, I think I've counted at least 5 separate jobs. You started at the Myanmar Times, which is a storied institution in the country. Maybe we can kick it off there.
Oh, it was to work there. I mean, you felt like a bit of a rock star walking in the doors of the Myanmar Times, because everyone knows the Myanmar Times. People even recognize me just because we had our photos printed with our stories. So, it was like working for the New York Times. I don't think that's an exaggeration. And it was exciting and also disappointing when I first joined. I thought it was going to be sort of fast-paced, a close-knit team of, really throwing ideas around and stuff. But there were there were only old hands who had been in the country for many years, and they were not welcoming to me. That changed as I was, no longer the rookie. And as more and more journalists joined the company, the culture was really in flux, and there was a lot of ego flying around the newsroom, like trying to outdo each other on the kinds of stories we broke, which is a fantastic thing for readers. I don't break news. I'm more of a features writer, but it was always, how good were your sources? How senior were they? There was a bit of one-upmanship. Ultimately, I got fired. The first place in my life I've ever been fired from, I joined a long list of journalists that Ross fired. He was hot-headed with his staff. But that was a really good thing for me because it propelled me into freelancing, which is my first love. And that is that's what I do today. Like I'm a writer and I love working for myself, but it was such a perilous existence because I was writing for 10 cents a word and surviving on that. And then the fact that you need to pay a translator or find sources that speak English or that answer emails, in a country where there's very low internet penetration and you're asking them for an email. I had to do all my interviews face-to-face in person because the phone lines were too bad. It would be too crackly. So things like that. When you're on staff at the Myanmar Times, like Ross was so generous. We could go anywhere we wanted because he would barter advertising. So I'd say, Ross, can I go to Chiang Mai and I'll write a few stories for the tourism supplement? And he'd be like, sure, go. You can go work in Mandalay, do some stories while you're there. I'll just sell some ads to Air KBZ and that will pay for your flight because they can just have an ad in the newspaper. So, but then when you're, there's only so many hours in the day as a freelancer, it's very hard to make ends meet. And then necessity again propelled me into different experiences like the British Embassy, which, that would never have crossed my desk on a normal day. So I'm really grateful for those 5 different jobs that I had.
Yeah, well, let's talk about what you did at the British Embassy. Of course, they don't need journalists, right?
I didn't think they would even give me a look in, to be honest, when I applied. That was amazing. I think that might be my all-time favourite job. The British Embassy, so I lived in London for 3 years. I have a British passport. But to see the embassy in work in a former colonial country, but in a time of change, there's a lot of sensitivities. And I was working for the business arm, so I worked for UK Trade and Investment, and they hired me to do a lot of research and writing. So it was a great fit for me. Not something, I would never have changed careers permanently, but the people I got to meet, and politics and diplomacy fascinates me, and to see that and to be within the embassy, so not interviewing them. Everything, that I heard was, obviously off the record. I wasn't allowed to write any articles while I worked there, but it was just, learning how diplomacy works. I think it kind of, the way business deals are done, the hosting of all these cocktail parties on the lawns of the ambassador's residence. It was really exciting for me. I got to have dinner with the producer of Chariots of Fire, who was a lord. I had been schlepping around Yangon in flip-flops with my satchel or whatever. And then at the British Embassy, it was all, the staff had drivers. I didn't have a car or a driver, but it was a different existence, and it gave me, an inside look.
And then, something different again. You did journalism with the UN. Now, I had no idea the United Nations funded journalism in Myanmar. So could you explain a little bit about that role?
Yeah, that was also an opportunity that I relished. And there are not, I guess, there weren't many freelancers in Myanmar, and they were looking for people with research and writing skills. They effectively hired me as an in-house journalist, and they sent me to areas that had been decimated by Cyclone Nargis some years before, and also drought-stricken areas. So I did this 10-day mission with them, and they wanted like an in-depth article and also a series of articles. So it was unusual. They paid for all my travel, and they presented the people to me with the stories that they said, here's a community, go and get their stories, listen to them, and then write up articles for different outlets in Myanmar. And I also did training, and they had a couple of different other initiatives, but it was mostly this mission that I did. And I was really happy to do that because the UN, they had been working in the area for like a decade and really trying to bring about change to make these communities more resilient to climate change. But my gosh, it's an uphill battle. The challenges are confronting. And also getting access in Myanmar is not easy. I also worked for UNAIDS, and they sent me up to Kachin State, and I went into prisons. Well, they're supposed to be drug rehabilitation centres, but they're prisons really for drug users. And I, as a journalist, I was going to places that were, marked in red on the map. I never would have these were border areas with China where there's a lot of heroin abuse and things like that. It was again, I was writing for them a series of case studies about harm reduction in Myanmar. And it's also a delicate relationship. Even with the reformist government, the UN works carefully and as respectfully as possible, but while still trying to bring about change. So there was quite a lot of nuance to the relationships. But they, gave me very senior government ministers to interview. I went to Naypyidaw, and it was an open door to the UN. Whereas if I tried to go as a freelance journalist for the Myanmar Times or Mizima, they just wouldn't have granted me the time of day. And it didn't mean that I wrote it in a less interesting way or in a softly way. It was still about, what are the issues and how can I present them in a simple, straightforward way for, the general public. So they were really good experiences, and Save the Children as well, and Pact Microfinance as well. I did quite a lot of writing for. And that also, those kinds of projects kept me afloat as a freelancer because the pay was, radically different if you're working for the UN compared to a magazine.
Yeah, absolutely. What an array of interesting work you found there at that time. But now maybe the most interesting one, I think, for foreigners who lived and worked in Myanmar at the time that you did. As you mentioned, no journalism is unmediated. So your work with the global New Light of Myanmar, another well-known journalism institution, though for different reasons. Could you tell us about your time there?
Well, I mean, the New Light of Myanmar is famous for all the wrong reasons in Myanmar. But I have to say, I always had an ambition to work there. I had previously written to them and my emails just went unanswered. But then one day, a friend of mine emailed me and said, hey, do you want to go for a job interview? Because the paper's changing, in the lead up to the election, they want a foreign editor. And they had a partnership with Kyoto News in Japan that's coming to an end. So they need a foreign editor to replace Sean, the Japanese Australian, because he's going back to Tokyo. So I went in for an interview and it was an interesting place. I immediately got that sense. I had a job interview at like a 20-foot long table, but the people seemed nice. But there was also definitely an air of mystery, like, I wasn't given the usual information you get when you go to a newsroom. They were just kind of telling me, we want the paper to be people-focused and we want you to help us improve standards, and you'll have the chance to report on, proper things that are people-focused in the public interest. And so I was just so curious. I said yes. And they were like, can you start tonight? And I was like, no. But I started the next week and the people were the nicest people. I'm still in contact with some of them today, and they're such thoughtful, a kind group of people, young people, old, sick, well, party going, healthy, really just a really diverse group of people. And so I worked their night shifts, which is actually how the day is run, with the printing press going off around 11 p.m. in the lead up to the election. And it was I got a little bit scared close to the election because there were all these rumours that there was going to be a coup. And I knew that I was quite close to the source of where these rumours were from because, we were part of the Ministry of Information. So I was actually employed by the Ministry of Information. And the censorship that occurred there's a chapter in my book called The Man in the Clouds, because I never did work out who was censoring me. I wasn't told, and I did ask. But stories would be changed from the time I left at 11 p.m. to when I got back to work the next day. And I never understood who was doing it. Was there a couple of men in the clouds? I don't know. And some of the decisions were really surprising. So it also did have a slightly ominous edge to it. And it was a very basic place to work. So it gave me an inside look at how little Myanmar's public sector spends on things like its national newspaper. Like, everyone worked on plastic chairs, the computers were ancient. I won't speak about the toilet facilities. There was nowhere to go and get food or anything. It was an uncomfortable place to work physically, and there were rats in the newsroom and stuff. And I guess that also partly reflects the value that the regime in Myanmar placed on providing information to the public, because they certainly didn't, provide any trappings to staff who worked under some pretty terrible conditions. Like, a couple of the editors slept at their desk. They worked such long hours. The news editor did not get a day off. I think he got 2 days annual leave a year, I think. And he worked 7 days a week. So it gave me an inside look at how, Myanmar's public sector, the conditions, they're pretty tough. So it was fascinating and wonderful. I was only there for a few months because after the election, it went back to that kind of repetitive, dull content, I have to say. And with the election out of sight, my remit had been fulfilled of, trying to provide good election coverage.
Well, how did your newly lit colleagues deal with these privations? And working at this complicated moment for the Ministry of Information, being directed to report in a certain way as the rest of the country was changing around them. Could you give us some insight into the minds of your friends there?
They were frustrated, but they were not new hires like me, and they had joined the New Light when it was, truly the dim light, because they love English and they wanted to practice English. And there were very few opportunities to do that, and the Global New Light was one of them. But yes, there were also a few young journalists who wanted to hit the streets and wanted to do reporting. And when I came in, I did like a couple of workshops, and they were out like asking people on the street, what do you think is going to happen in the election, and covering things about, the difficulties people were facing, like the logistical difficulties of voting, of organising, a national election. there were also some who were deeply frustrated and condescending towards, what they called the delusional attitude of, these men in power, these military men who think that their way is the best way for Myanmar. So they were not regime lackeys, that as I did expect some of them to be. I only met one, the news editor, Wallace. He had been in the military. He was a military man through and through. He used to say, I'm a military man first, a Karen second, and a journalist third, Jessica, as if these are my priorities. And, there was no talking back. You did what you were told. We always did what we were told. But, Myanmar people have put up with an enormous amount, and they do it with, grace and dignity, and they're not sniping, moaning types of people. They get on with it. Like the chief reporter had terrible back problems and he was sitting on a plastic chair. So they gave me, when I said, I can't work on a plastic chair or I'll have back problems. So they brought in a big chair for me from the main office where the admin people had proper chairs. And I said, but he needs one too. And they said no. And he said, no, come on. I said, no, I won't take the chair unless you have a chair. But he was all for just having back problems all the time and not causing a problem, which I think is pretty reflective of the stoicism of Myanmar people, which never failed to amaze me while I was living there.
Right, yeah. Why did the admin team have good chairs, but the news team did not?
Well, it was admin and accounts. So they were seen as, even though we were not producing revenue, which I was saying, this is a missed opportunity. Like, you've got so many people reading this newspaper, you could sell proper advertising. They were seen as they were in a different building and they were seen as the business heads. So like management, that was management, right? And they had like air conditioning and stuff, but ours didn't work properly. And they were in more comfortable surrounds, I would say. It was just interesting, isn't it? I wasn't sure about a lot of stuff. But they also, when we had a few military people come, senior people from the ministry, and they would have the meetings and stuff in that building, and they might get a whip round tour of the newsroom, but they didn't really care. So I think it was more like the VIPs needed proper chairs.
Wow, yeah. And you're it, right? Like you mentioned your predecessor, but I don't think any other foreigners were employed at the Global New Light of Myanmar, right?
Well, so I was the first foreigner appointed on staff, so directly hired, not just brought in. And then I hired 2 sub-editors. So they said, they were like, can you just handle it? Bring in 2 more foreigners. We don't even know where to start. Where would you find them? So I had a couple come in, and then after me, there was a couple more. So, you could count on one hand how many foreigners have worked there. And at the time, all my fellow journalists rolled their eyes, or worse, at me. Why would you work for the dark side? This rag that isn't worth the ink that's printed, the ink that is printed on it. And I think it's because I'm more of a writer than a journalist. I was like, but wouldn't that be fascinating? When would I ever get the chance to see inside something truly Orwellian? And I hoped that I would get to see things that I would want to write about in book form. I didn't go in that kind of calculated way, but of course that's why it appealed. And it's like, if you're a journalist, if you really want to learn about something, don't do it as an outsider, but without being deceitful. But you need to immerse yourself in really what it's like. And to, the stories that my colleagues told me, while I may not reveal that their stories came from the New Light of Myanmar things, they have fundamentally shaped my outlook on Myanmar. And I always try to tell those stories at every chance I get. So I have no regrets. And also the newspaper was trying to change. So we weren't just pumping out propaganda. It was actively trying to be a better newspaper. So, I was genuinely working for that. But you should have seen the comments on my Facebook page. You are crazy and you are bad. And this is the wrong decision. Because it's really, it was derided and hated in Myanmar, especially by journalists.
Sure, it's the reform revolution argument, inherent to all these different contexts, still going on. But the Myanmar Times was itself derided. So many exiled journalists thought the Myanmar Times was a sort of benighted, evil institution for cooperating with the military regime. So you can see it in both ways. You can see it in all sorts of directions.
That is 100% correct. When I went to Chiang Mai with the Myanmar Times, a foreigner an expat in a cafe said looked at me like, you work for the Myanmar Times. They were like, but that's government run. And I was like, no, it's a private enterprise. And they just kind of shook their head and walked away. So within Myanmar, it was the best newspaper Myanmar had, and it was the only private newspaper Myanmar had. So it had, I think it was had a much higher status inside Myanmar, but especially in places like Chiang Mai, and sure, among activists, democracy activists, it was also frowned upon. But the New Light, I mean, that was in a league all of its own.
Okay, Jess, now let's head towards the end of your book, onto another topic. You spent quite a bit of time in the closing pages on the predicament of a man named Niranjan. So could you tell us his story and why it's important?
Yeah, what happened with Niranjan upset me deeply. So I had stopped working for the embassy after a year or so, and Sue and Martin, Sue had been the vice consul and she was going to Pakistan for her next posting. We'd stayed friends, and she told me about this British man, an accountant, who was in insane prison and had been treated appallingly. His basic legal rights, such as being charged with a crime or, access to a lawyer. He was not given any food, which actually is not so unusual of itself. But the fact that he had not been charged is such a gross violation. And I just thought, how, if you go to prison and you get a 10-year sentence, every day is at least working towards the end of that sentence. If you do not know what your sentence is, it is pointless. It is, you're no closer to what, you have no idea. And I thought that would be purgatory. So when she left, I said, look, I will help him. I'll do what you were doing, because they hadn't hired a vice consul in a totally unofficial capacity, except the embassy helped me in certain ways. And, they were aware of the papers being handed to me. I was his power of attorney. So I would go to his remand hearings that were held all the time, but we were getting nowhere, and years were passing, and there were 3 co-defendants with him. These were financial crimes that they were accused of, withdrawing money from the ATMs. Now, 2 of those people said they weren't in Myanmar on the day that some of these ATM withdrawals were made. So when I first met these guys, I was very, very upset to see the conditions alongside, Myanmar people being kept in the same conditions, but they were bewildered and scared, and they spoke Tamil and English, and were really, this is truly, the most powerless situation you could be in. And they were very kind people. They would say things like, oh, don't go to any trouble. Like, don't worry about bringing us food. Like, we'll make do, and didn't want to take up too much of my time. But it started, so I was, drawn in very closely. But oversight of the Myanmar courts does not happen. And when they saw a foreigner like me turning up, there was definitely some intimidation. Like, I was followed from the court once, and another time the judge asked for a copy of my passport. And it was made very clear to me that I was now under surveillance in association with them. And it wasn't so much for me that I was worried, but for my Bangladeshi husband, because I could see the way these guys were being treated. And some of them were Indian citizens, and Niranjan is of Sri Lankan descent, but he held a British passport. And the way that they can lock you up and throw away the key, and there is nothing that you can do about it, that terrified me. And I thought, there's nothing to stop them taking Sherpa if my involvement in the case annoys them too much, or if I push things too much. And simply by being present when the case started seemed to be angering the judges. And I wasn't working for the British Embassy. So I was conflicted, and Niranjan, would phone me up whenever he could access a phone. And I found it really, really distressing. So I had to make a decision that looked after my family and did what I hoped was okay. Very happy footnote is that Niranjan and I have been in touch. He's my Facebook friend. He's back in the UK, and I have sent him a copy of my book. So he's a free man, and I hope he's rebuilding his life. But he was in prison for 7 years. So that would traumatize a person quite deeply. So he tells me he's doing okay.
That's good. I'm glad he's back. Although 7 years is a long time. Okay, well, now to wrap up, Jess, you've written in this book about all these different roles that you had and many of the stories that you worked on. Maybe do you want to give our listeners your favourite or particularly noteworthy kind of story, a bit of a behind-the-scenes thing? I know that I myself read your stories on the hair trade, separately to the book, many years ago, and you write in the book about eating the cobra. Yeah, so which ones?
For the quirkiness, it was definitely the human hair and the cobras. I also did really fun stories like Myanmar's male modelling industry. It was starting to take off. So I went and watched a bunch of models walk around and interviewed them and stuff. There were a lot, and I was flown to a winery in Shan State and got to stay in their beautiful accommodation overlooking the hill. But for quirkiness was the human hair. So Myanmar has a thriving human hair trade. And that's partly because Burmese women have beautiful hair that hasn't been dyed relentlessly. And also because you have nuns. So when nuns go to the monastery, they shave off their hair and they can then sell their hair. So I found wholesale hair dealers, and a guy walked in with a ponytail that was like 1.5 meters long. And I was sitting on this plastic chair and there was just hair covering all the ground, like in my toes, because you take your shoes off when you go inside somewhere. So there was just hair all over my feet, and it was fascinating. And then I went to the market and met a woman who an elderly woman who every morning she brushed her hair and took out the hair on her hairbrush and put it in a plastic bag. And then after 6 months, she had enough hair to then go and sell. And then she got that 500 chat, which would be, is less than $1. And she donated that to the monastery. So that was a really cool story that I loved. And I found that story. There were so many stories in Myanmar. I remember sitting with Thierry and a girl walked past with really long hair, and I was like, far out, that is such long hair. And she was like, oh, you should do a story about that. And then I was off. That was, she gave me my first tip into that story. So Myanmar, is rich. Stories are around every corner. And that's why I loved freelancing, because the variety, was astounding, the topics that you could cover. And then the cobra one I loved as well, because there are so many cobras in Yangon. And I met the zookeeper, and he was going to people's homes and catching them. And he told me that a couple came back from Singapore or something, and they hopped into bed and there was a cobra in the bed. And he said, but it didn't matter. It just slithered out.
Very freaky. As Australians, you and I are used to the tiger snake in the sleeping bag, but I think a cobra in a Yangon bed is probably more freaky. All right, now it's the final question, which on Myanmar Musings, the final question is always for a recommendation. Do you have a recommendation, something Myanmar related, for our listeners?
So I would recommend The Land of Green Ghosts by Pascal Coutouet, and it's a memoir, and he grew up in a very remote village in Myanmar, and he's a member of the Padong tribe, which have the women who are so striking with the giraffe. They're called the giraffe neck women because they wear the coils, copper coils, brass coils in their neck to elongate their neck. And his community was so remote that they didn't know that Elvis had died until 12 years after that news broke. And his story is extraordinary because he grew up in a very superstitious community. And he was a very curious young guy and met someone, I think, in a Mandalay restaurant, and life took him to Oxford University. So he ended up on the other side of the world. And so he's sort of straddling, academic research with the mysticism that he had taught to believe in. And it gives him such an interesting and beautiful outlook on life. He blends both so beautifully. There wasn't like, a terrible tension in him of having to choose. So I think that's a beautiful book, and that's one that stuck with me. And I got to meet him at the Irrawaddy Literature Festival, and he was just a ray of light. He seems a very kind person.
Oh yeah, that's a legendary classic that you've just suggested, and you've given an excellent testament to its quality. I think that the prose in that book is just so emotional. Like, it really takes you. It's not just a story, like an adventurous story, but it's tinged with real sort of nostalgia and beautiful, beautiful language. Yeah, so stellar recommendation. And that takes us to the end of the episode. So thanks a lot, Jess, for coming on Myanmar Musings.
Thanks, Luke. It's been a pleasure.